us to start this meeting. Dan, are you there as well? Dan Hort?
He is there. He's just muted.
Okay. So let's start the meeting at 7:01 and 43 seconds. Thanks everybody for joining. Once again, we have a quorum, which is wonderful. I wasn't able to reach Sarah today, so I don't know if she'll be able to get in or not, but it's okay. There is one bit of actual business that we have to do before we get into, well, a couple actually, but I just want to make sure I say it now and we can get to it later. We have to do the transfers, it looks like on July 15th. I gather that the select board is going to vote on them on the 14th, and then there's an expectation that we will vote on them on the 15th. Dan, are you online yet? Hello?
I'm here.
Do we have to vote on them before end of business on the 15th? Or if we have a 7 o'clock meeting on the 15th, is that okay?
I think if you have a 7 o'clock meeting on the 15th, that's okay.
All right, so it'll be a real quick in and out kind of deal, but put it on your calendar if you could, July 15th, because it's our fiduciary responsibility to do it. And so there you go. And I'll repeat this later on so that we're clear about it. Just to catch everybody else, and maybe it's worth going through the minutes quick right now and get them out of the way. Has everybody gotten the 6 minutes that were sent out the other day?
I haven't read them.
Yeah, I did. Unfortunately, I went through all of them and cleaned them up. We don't necessarily, if people haven't read them and don't feel comfortable approving them, we can wait for July 15th to do that. It would be my preference to do it tonight, but it doesn't have to be tonight. It's, we're already 5 months, in arrears on this for all the obvious reasons.
Yeah, and according to the state, you're supposed to do it as soon as possible or within the next meeting. So you're very late.
I know.
Fred, I'm sorry, me.
Go ahead.
I liked the idea earlier that you proposed that because they're recorded, that the minutes and that take on a little bit less gravitas because the meetings are actually all online. So, and I feel comfortable if you have read them that I would vote in favor of them.
I read them in excruciating detail because I went line by line, word by word.
I love your pain. I'm going to move the minutes.
I will second that.
We're doing it as a group, all 6. Yes?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Exactly.
I've got a second. All those in favor of approving those minutes, please signify with your hand in the air.
Can I say aye?
Of course you can.
Okay.
But I think it looks good on Zoom to put your hand in the air and shake your booty like you just know. I can't see Linda anyway. Linda, was that an aye from you? You might want to unmute.
I'm trying to unmute her, but there we go. Say aye, Linda.
Aye.
There you
All
go.
You can't see me.
No.
No.
Oh, and we'll solve
All
that.
right, I'll just listen in. I'll just listen in. Fine.
All right, and we can solve the video problem at some point if you like. So thank you for trusting that the minutes are intact. I believe they are.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was a lot of work.
Yes, it was.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And through a broken nose and COVID. So I mean, not for nothing. Did you? You're my hero. Hero, I guess. You've had a year, and you have 2 kids. Hey.
I have 5 kids.
5 kids. Whoa.
Oh my, 5 kids and a whole lot of pets.
I can't
2
even-
dogs, a cat, a frog.
You should write a book. Actually, probably be a bestseller.
You're not the first person.
So,
If it adds up to 19, I've got a title for you.
so here's the deal. At our last meeting, we had a speculative, and I want to emphasize that for those who might be listening in, that it was speculative, first foray into thinking about the Finance Committee's role in being an advisory board to a town that is dealing with COVID. So what the budget impact might be, what areas might be affected, and where we might have something useful to say to the TA and to the select board. And as you may recall, if you read the minutes, you certainly recall, that kind of ended with questions. One of which was, could we get Dan to join us? And he has joined us. Thank you, Dan. Another was, is there a useful role for the FinCom to play? And then some general, well, not general, but more problematic questions like, do we know which areas are going to be affected and how deeply they're going to be affected? And is there anything that can be done about that? And to some degree, the select board started to address that last night. But interestingly, I thought anyway, at least three, maybe more, said, we want to hear what the FinCom has to say after they talk to Dan. So we actually have a more pronounced role, at least in terms of having been asked to develop an opinion, where before I think we were just kind of out there in the wilderness. And with that in mind, I think there are a few generic questions we want to think about tonight, which is what kind of advice can we give, and what areas, and what can we know and what can't we know? Because I think one of the areas that I keep hearing over and over again is that people want specifics where specifics aren't really possible. And I think in addition, we ought to spend a bit of time thinking about the areas beyond operations and the obvious replacement capital kind of stuff that may have been overlooked, or may be, or in the process of being overlooked, that have a real impact this year going to next year, but also potentially if this is a multi-year issue. We don't know that the virus will be under control by next year. And there are a lot of people out there who are planning on the assumption that we're going to be back to some kind of normal by next year. And I think that's a hopeful assumption, but I don't know what it's based on at this point. You know, with the cases increasing as they are around the country, I think you can make an equally plausible scenario that we're talking about the same issues a year from now with the same budget issues. So, but with revenues skewed however they're skewed. So before I ask Dan to start, he's going to start by talking to us somewhat about, I guess, the document that he sent to the select board that was forwarded to everybody, which kind of outlines his preliminary thoughts about where the areas of concern are and what can be done about them. Does anybody have any comments or thoughts that they want to share before we turn the floor over to Dan for his initial? No? All right, Dan?
Nice to see everybody again, even under these circumstances.
And nice to see your name, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Oh, so there's a story why my picture is never on. I did it once and then saw on screen what a mess my office looks like. And so I moved my chair so I was front of a curtain in my office, and they all thought I was sitting in the bathtub and was in front of a shower curtain. So that's the last time that I've been on camera.
You might want to consider a green screen, and then you could do all kinds of cool things behind you.
That's true too. But
Just need a backdrop that you can put up, like has like a big picture of a bookshelf or something.
Or given your current trajectory, a palm tree.
So what Fred just said is exactly correct. I think we could figure out a solution for what's going to happen if this was a one-year situation. We could conceivably use free cash along with some money in the stabilization fund to help balance our budget. But if we don't know for sure that it's going to be a one-year problem, that it's going to be over a number of years, that solution is only going to work for us once. And then we'll find ourselves kicking the can down the road and instead of making decisions. So last night in a conversation with the select board, I was a little bit surprised by some of the comments because it maybe I worry too much, but they didn't. Well, one select board member in particular didn't think it was going to be that much of a hit to our revenues. Didn't think that the room occupancy tax was going to take such a hit, or that the meals tax was going to take a hit. From everything I'm seeing, I kind of am not seeing that. I think it's going to be more of a hit than what we think. We just opened bids today for portable restrooms. Portable restrooms in FY 2021 are going to be, the winning bid was $210,000, and last year it was $42,000. So some of this will be covered by the CARES Act, some of the money that's available for reimbursement, but we may see expenses coming up during the year that aren't covered by the CARES Act, and that we're not expecting right now. So when I look at it, I think at least for the FY21 and FY22 budget, I think we're going to see hits to beach revenues. Could easily see it depending on how many people are in town and what the scenario is. But the CMAS fund for operating that we use, that's the money received from the purple bags. Recreation fund is going to see a hit. The ambulance fund probably going to see a slight hit. Probably if there's less people in town, there's going to be less calls. Whenever I say any of these, this is my best guess right now. I really don't know the answer, and we may have a better idea, say at the end of August or in September. But October 5th is when we have to approve our budget at the town meeting. And for those of you who, I think everybody's heard this, but my last day here is going to be July 31st, and the new town administrator starts on August the 3rd. So I'm trying to at least have solutions on the table as much as possible, so that when she starts, she's got kind of this is where I think we need to be looking at. The room tax, meals tax in the FY21 budget right now accounts for about $500,000. So I don't know what type of hit we're going to see on that, and we may not know for 6 months to a year to actually have gone through a year to see what type of hit that's going to be. So when I was talking to the select board last night, it's, there are various options that we could use. If we thought we were going to have a $500,000 shortfall, we might be able to do, cuts in departments that might be able to come up with a portion of that, and then use some free cash to balance it, or some part of the stabilization fund to balance it. But if this is going to be an ongoing, that we're going to have to do this for the next 2 or 3 years, that's only going to work for so long before those funds are depleted. So there's no question that we need to try and cut anything we can out of the budget, but there isn't a whole lot of fat in the budget. But we may see, we may be able to cut some of the beach expenses because of less activity at the beaches. Same thing for the recreation areas. Departments that are affected that don't have the same operational capacity that they did prior to this, we may be able to look at kind of refining the budget. The selectmen last night spoke very strongly in favor of town staff and not furloughing people. It was brought up that perhaps we could work with the unions and offer certain people the opportunity to, say, work a 4-day work week. So they'd be still basically employed full-time, but they'd be working 80% instead of 100%. And then their compensation could be reduced to 80% as well. Now, in some areas of town, that's not going to work. But if an employee thinks that that's something they might like to do, we could potentially give them the opportunity to do that. So I would kind of leave that in the hands of the department heads. If they have anybody who would prefer to work a 4-day work week and, work 80% of the time and get compensated 80%, I'd kind of leave it to the department heads to explore that with their staff, because in some areas you aren't going to be able to get by with somebody there only 4 days of the week instead of 5. So there's lots of things to discuss with very little knowledge ahead of the game. As I said, I'm leaving at the end of July, but I will still be a resource for the new town administrator and for the finance department when people are looking through things and saying, well, how can we do this, or where did this number come from? I'm not going away. I'll be there to help out and provide any assistance that's expected of me. I think that's kind of how I would start this conversation out, and I'll just put it out there and then answer questions if people have them.
So Dan, I have a question. This is Ira. I don't know the union contracts, but if the money isn't there, are we still responsible for the employees?
So in almost every union contract, there is a provision if you're going to furlough people or lay them off, that usually it's the most recent hire that would be let go. I would say we're obligated for it, but if the town makes a decision that they need to reduce the staff count or reduce payroll costs, is how I would put it instead, we'd then have to look a little deeper in the union contract and see exactly how that works. So I think one of the things that I've heard other towns have done, and I would rather see us do that if we ever got to a point where we needed to reduce our payroll cost, is I'd rather see us do something where we're working like a 4-day work week instead of, Linda, I'm glad to see your cat enjoys, I think it's your cat,
Yes.
enjoys finance. I think what we would rather see, and I think most people would rather see this, is rather than lay somebody off and have them lose their job and lose their pay, is kind of doing across the board something, whatever that might be, so that certain people aren't taking 100% hit. Maybe everybody takes a 90%, they work at 90% level instead of 100%. And everybody would still then be assured of having, a job and being compensated.
Are we losing an opportunity to trim the budget for the future? I mean, this is the terrible situation also presents opportunities. And since the town has been talking about trimming the budget for as long as I've been in the town, maybe this is just an opportunity to do just that and go forward in a leaner way.
I don't think you can get much leaner than what you are in Wellfleet. And to be honest with you, I haven't heard people saying we've got to cut the town budget. Your tax rate in Wellfleet and your budget in Wellfleet is well below the average in the state. I think one of the selectmen, when she was leaving, said that we were the 16th lowest tax rate in the state. So I don't look at this as an opportunity, because I look at it always as an opportunity that we're always trying to look at how we can operate more efficiently. So we're always looking for that. Whenever I have a staff department where somebody leaves in a department, we always look at it and say, okay, do we have to fill this position? Is there a more efficient or better way to do this? So we look at that every time that the opportunity comes up. I think to really have any significant impact on what your budget is, you can't, in my opinion, you can't just say, okay, we're going to cut some staff here and it's going to have no impact. It's going to have an impact. So it, you know, if we decide to cut somebody from DPW, we might then say, okay, so the cemeteries are only going to get mowed once a year. Maybe they won't get mowed at all. There's going to be a corresponding reduction in services as well. And the town has to decide if they're okay with that and what they're okay with reducing or eliminating.
Dan, I have a question. Jeff
Sure.
Tash. You know, I was at last night's select board meeting, and yeah, there wasn't a sense of crisis from most of the board members. What I'm very curious about, I haven't heard anybody talk about, is how susceptible are we to cuts in monies from the state? Because every time, you know, you keep hearing how the state's budgets have been decimated, and it doesn't appear that there may be money coming to them. How can you just sort of share, is that a legitimate concern, and how would that hurt us?
You know, I think it's a legitimate concern, although you have not heard anybody at the state level say that. But the state, you know, is obviously really hurting for money as well. They're, you know, they've had a lot of additional cost related to this virus. And when we talk about, you know, room and meals tax, that definitely impacts the state as well. The town gets 4%, the state gets 5.7%. So any cuts in those taxes are definitely, you're going to see it at the state. With so many people out of work, the income tax revenues for the state have got to take a serious hit. I think it's a political hot potato that no one's going to dare touch right now. They're not going to say that it's, you know, that we're going to have to cut, you know, aid to municipalities. But something's got to give, you know. It's at every level of government. I think every level of government, you know, I just read something that somebody who was testifying before Congress said that the financial impact of COVID-19 is going to be somewhere in the area of $7 trillion. That money's got to come from somewhere. And, you know, so, and nobody's going to be flush with money. So I think that there'll be enough pushback from municipalities towards the state that will limit the amount of cutbacks that the state can make, but they're not going to be flush with cash either. So it's got to, for them, it's got to come from somewhere. You know, taxpayers aren't going to want to, you know, who have just been locked up and not had a job are not going to want to go through and say, okay, yeah, you can increase our income tax or our sales tax or whatever. So a lot of questions to be answered yet, and I don't think anybody's ready to answer them yet.
Fred, is it okay if you got me?
Yes.
Can I go?
Please.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
So I was last night listening to the select board meeting. I was shocked a little bit at the lack of urgency and waiting to address this. So I'm happy that we have the opportunity tonight to talk about it. And the thing that I see happening is this is a complex and complicated issue. And thank you for, I wanted to jump in on the back of what Dan said, because this really is a multi-layered, multi-government issue that isn't as simplistic as just saying, hey, let's take a little bit from this fund and let's take a little bit of that fund, because I think we're going to be dealing with this several years down the road based on quite a few facts that, again, the state, you know, you kind of turn to the state and say, hey, can we have some money? Let's get some from the feds. Nobody's going to have it, and every county, every town in the country is going to be looking for that. So that definitely, the income is definitely an issue. As far as saying, okay, this beach parking lot is closed and that beach parking lot is closed, so that you can come to a number, those numbers are exponentially going to be larger than just 1 year of calculating what we made this year and subtracting it. Just a quick couple of examples of things that I'm thinking about is meals tax. You can say, okay, well, we're going to get meals tax because our restaurants are open again. Meals tax is 5% of the check size. These people aren't out, they're not drinking, they're not staying, they're getting takeout. The ticket size is smaller, they may look busy, but you're taking money on less revenues. The parking revenues are diminished. That's going to have a long-term effect on people deciding in the future whether they want to spend their tourism dollars in Wellfleet or not. So I fear that not having access to the beaches and to things like that are also going to, impact that. People are renting cottages, which is great, but they're renting cottages because they have stoves and cooking facilities in them. So they're not going to be out spending those dollars when they're here like they usually do. So I think it's a little simplistic. And again, I'm just throwing those things out there because it's a little simplistic to say we're going to lose this revenue. Our budget may be lean, but we really need to consider a multi-year impact to our revenues, and the fact that every other town is asking for this money and it's just not going to be available. I liked Dan's suggestion too, which was I was thinking about last night, is just making sure that if we are in a multifaceted approach, we're going to need to, if we can cut the services that are directly impacted by the level of service, if we can cut some in that area, I would not go into spending all of our reserve cash on year one of this. If we can maybe manage personnel through attrition. If somebody leaves, do we hire them back right away, or do we manage that? I don't know if OPEB is going to be an option for maybe we cut it this year or pay a smaller percentage of the OPEB. And my question on that from a financial standpoint would be, if we do cut OPEB for a year or put a smaller percentage of OPEB for a year, if we can make that up over maybe the next 5 years, so we're amortizing it and paying a little bit more once we get out of COVID. We're certainly not alone in making all of these decisions, and the money is, I fear the money is going to dry up. It's a big elephant in the room. So I think that there needs to be some urgency, and I'm really glad we're talking about this tonight. Thanks.
Can I add one thing too before you respond, Dan? Because in the document that Dan sent to us, it looks like, heading anyway, looks like that. You make a distinction between estimated local receipts and receipts reserved for appropriation, which include the ambulance fund, the CMAS fund, the recreation fund, and the beach fund. And I believe I saw in one of your documents that the beach fund provides $1 million estimate to the operating budget. At least it's assumed that we're going to get $1 million of revenue out of it. But if I understand this correctly, and I think this dovetails with what Kathy was just saying, these are going to affect the FY22 budget more than they're going to affect the FY21 budget. Is that correct?
That is correct. Because the money from the beach fund that we're using in FY21 is money that's already been collected last year, pre-COVID. So when there's a shortfall or reduction in revenues, it's going to be when we try to go to the beach fund and say we want to fund the operating budget in 22, and there isn't near as much money in there as there usually is.
I think it's an important point to raise, in that people may breathe a sigh of relief thinking, oh, well, the budget wasn't really hit that hard next year because a lot of the monies for it are already in place. It's the year after, when we get to budgeting next year, when we have $500,000 or $700,000 less than we need to fund basic operations.
And it goes back to what we said at the start, is this isn't going to, this likely is not going to be a one-year thing. This is going to be a multi-year effect. Whether, at a minimum, it's going to be 2 years, because estimated local receipts are going to affect FY21, and the beach fund and those funds are going to affect FY22. In reality, I think it's going to be multi-year, because I don't think we're going to be back to normal in the summer of 2021.
Can I throw out one more thing on that as well? You look and you say, okay, the tax revenue, our local tax revenue is, is the basis for the budget. But I believe that within that also has the possibility of being in peril. I'm watching businesses left and right close their doors and shutter. The next thing after the business goes is the primary home. So there may be a very real effect on the collection of property taxes in the second and third year of this, based on people's hierarchy of what's the last thing to go in a financial crisis. But if people stop paying taxes, then it's just frightening. And I think that is a very real possibility. We may need to, I think it would be prudent to possibly put a revenue loss percentage on those taxes to build into the budget going forward as in an abundance of caution.
Just as an FYI, our collector, Karen Murphy, gave me some statistics that for this year, our tax collection revenues, I think she said as of May 1st, were almost identical to what they were the year before. So in that first year, it didn't, in the first year of COVID, it didn't have an impact. But if you're able to collect, say, 95% of your tax revenues that are assessed and billed, and the next year it goes down to 92% or lower, that's going to have an impact.
And then you snowball bond ratings and a whole bunch of other things on that. So.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen the impact yet of people losing their jobs or getting off of unemployment and not having income coming in after that. That's going to start to play out, I think, in the next 3 to 4 months. And
The extra $600 federal payment, I believe, ends right in July.
yeah, and on top of that, and we can reserve this part of the strategizing for a little bit later, but I think there are a number of big ticket items coming down the pike that we've been talking about for a few years as part of the strategic planning thing. They are extra monies that the town is going to ask for on top of the normal revenue sources. They're going to be debt service or whatever, and of course, I mean, dredging and things like that, that people may be disinclined to want to spend on if they're not working or if they're uncertain about the future or whatnot. So it could affect the town in ways that go way beyond operations.
So this conversation can be very depressing, but it is kind of our new reality right now, and I think it's good for us at least to be able to start talking about this. When I'm talking to the select board last night, it was, we know it's going to impact us, but we have no idea how much. So we're and their inclination was kind of to wait a little bit until we know more about how much it's going to affect us, what the impact is going to be. But we've got to make some decisions, I think, based on estimates at this point, because if we just go as if nothing has changed and then find all of a sudden our revenues have dropped by 5% and we didn't do anything in the budget to account for that, then we're going to be scrambling. And I think, I was pleasantly surprised last night that the selectmen, they basically want to have this concept and this discussion on every Board of Selectmen agenda to get an update on what's going on. They also want to hear from the Finance Committee as to what their thoughts are and what a possible plan might be to how to address all of this. So they're really looking to your group for some sort of guidance. And they're very receptive to hearing what you have to say because, none of us have the answers, so.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Bob.
So there's some hiring to be done next fiscal year, is that on hold because we're not having the town meeting? So it's basically a hiring freeze by default?
So because we do not yet have an FY21 budget approved and won't have one until October, what the town staff are required to do, and that's the town accountant and the town administrator, is they call it the 1/12 budget. And you go through and look at your budget and say, okay, how much are we going to have to spend in the month of July? The select board then has to approve it, and it has to be submitted to the state. So in general, you may have seasonal staff members that are brought on if they're needed, but I'm working with the departments to try and really look at it and say, from a seasonal standpoint, do you really need that seasonal staff this year? Is that an area that we can remove at least from this year, because we're not going to have we're not going to have recreation the same as we normally would. Where DPW to some extent could be reduced a little bit, but the Council on Aging, if they have seasonal staff. So we're looking at every one of the seasonal staff members that we bring on to see whether they're really needed this year, or are we just bringing them on because we always do. So we're trying to go through each of those. There aren't any new hires, let me put year-round permanent hires that are in the budget. I just heard from the fire chief that another firefighter is leaving the department. They're down 3. That's a tough one to say, okay, we're not going to hire somebody to replace those.
Right.
But we do look at other departments that if there's a vacancy, can we hold off on filling that vacancy?
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question, Bob?
Yes. Well, there's, I guess, an article for 2 new paramedics, right? That's
It's still on the warrant. Before the warrant is closed, we'll have to decide whether that stays on the warrant or not. And then ultimately, for something like that, town meeting voters and voters at the ballot box are the ones who would decide whether that's added or not.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a couple of questions. Is there any chance that things that are on the warrant as normal appropriations might be, or that are in the budget as normal appropriations, might be moved into a different category as new debt, to kind of put it to the voters and whether they're willing to spend extra money for certain services or staff?
So without throwing anybody under the bus, can you give me an idea of an example of what you would be asking for there? I know when I worked in Provincetown, I think it was before I started as finance director, one year they were having problems balancing the budget, and they took the entire recreation department and made town meeting voters approve it by an override, which was a really unfortunate circumstance to just take one department and say, okay, we're going to ask you to vote on something like this. When I went through the budget, and I try not to do this, I try to take the emotions out of this. So when I look at the budget and I go, okay, could I cut down the human services grant? That wouldn't affect services delivered by the town, but it might affect services that are delivered to residents. So it still has the same impact. So yes, you could do what you asked, Fred, but I'd want somebody to help me with what area or what decision we might do that with.
Right, and that I guess that would be the basis for the discussion or debate. Typically when you talk about breaking down a budget like that, you say, well, there's the gotta haves and the nice to haves. And so you would throw the nice to haves in as discretionary. But if we're down 3 firefighters, that's to some degree not discretionary. We need to have that, but it's not necessarily fully funded. We asked the chief a couple of years ago, is it possible to come up with a model of what a sustainable fire department looks like in Wellfleet and what that would cost? What would we really have to pay to have people not leave on an annual basis? And how many do you need? And what are the multiples and what's the number? I don't know that we have that number, but let's say that that number was producible. Maybe that could be funded as an override because it's such an essential thing to the town, and people go, yeah, well, okay, I'll pay extra for that. As opposed to it being things like the library or the beach or the rec department or whatever, when you talk about cutting services or taking a person out of the mix, it might be possible to do it, but it doesn't save you a whole lot of money either.
So when I was preparing for the select board meeting, I separated out kind of what I looked at, what I did is I took public safety, so that's police and fire, and I took the education budget and also the unclassified budget, which is employee health insurance, the retirement assessment, the insurance on buildings and liability in town, and figured out that comes to 69% of the budget. So if you say that we can't step in and cut public safety, that we can't cut education, that we can't cut, the unclassified accounts, which are pretty much, already set, you've only got 31% of the budget left that you can cut. So there's not a whole lot there.
I guess what I'm saying is if we're funding public safety at some number, and that number is inadequate to provide it, but there's a bigger number that would provide it, perhaps there's a way to craft that you present it to the public and say, look, this is what you need, but we are traditionally or historically, we're underfunding it by 25%. So we can't crank the budget up in that area by that much necessarily. Maybe we could, but maybe there are other ways to get to that number. I was just wondering.
And I think what you just said there is probably a more, it's going to be having a meeting like this, a number of meetings like this with, say, the police chief or with the fire chief to really talk about what does the department need to run so that it has everything it needs, but there's also no fat there. What is that number?
Right.
And if that, I'm taking a wild guess here and saying that number, that we're not going to come up with a number that's less than what we have right now, so it's probably going to be more. And if we then said, okay, so if that's what we need to go to taxpayers and ask for an override to be able to fund it at the level it should be. I mean, that's, in a normal world, that's a great idea. Right now, I'm not sure if it helps us with the quandary we're in right now.
Can I ask you one other question? I'm sorry. The other day, well, yesterday, you said that you thought the shortfall might be $1 million in the next couple of years. That was kind of a guesstimate number, I think. As I understand it, well, I guess I don't understand based on the conversation I heard last night. Of that $1 million, where do you think it's coming from? Is it mostly from shortages of beach revenues, or?
So in my expectations or my estimates right now, I think beach revenues are definitely going to take a hit. I'm going to ask our beach administrator if she can make an estimate for me based on what she's seen right now. What type of revenues would she expect to come in from the beaches this year? So she may be able to give me some of an estimate there. I still believe that rooms and meals tax are going to get hit severely. There are a number of restaurants that have made great outdoor spaces, but they're not going to replace all the spaces they had when a table could be right next to each other, as opposed to now when a table has to be at least 6 feet away, and indoor dining is limited to 25%. So I really see those areas getting hit. And then, so you're talking about a lack of a hit to revenue there, and then I was expecting, to be honest, with the portable restroom bids to come in at around 250 today. So the fact that it was 210 was like a bonus almost, but that 210 compares to 42 from the previous year. So there's a $150,000 hit to expenses that also has to be covered some way.
What are we doing about capital expenses? Are we holding off on everything?
You know what? The select board have not decided on that yet. I think my recommendation to them when we talk about this is that we have to look at each item and say, do we have to have this year? And pre-COVID, we thought we could do something like the bandstand awning. We thought we could do something with the bandstand awning, and I'm not picking on them. It comes to mind, but maybe we can't. If the one that we have right now is in danger of falling down, maybe we need to take it down and wait until we're more financially capable to put a new one up. We need to look at each capital item, because based on what I'm estimating right now, almost every capital item is going to have to go on the warrant as an override. There aren't any extra funds to pay for capital items. So we've really got to look at each one and say, do we have to have it this year, or can we wait?
Dan, can I jump in, Jeff or Fred? I'm sorry. Can I jump in? I have a question for Dan. Obviously, two sides to the budget, the spending side and the revenue side. So I just wanted to jump in on the revenue side. What is the timing for the realization of the room tax? So what is the lag time? Because I have I'm going over your impact. I like your the impact statement to the revenues and expenses. And with the expected revenues based on, and room occupancy and meals tax are the ones that I'm concerned with, because again, that's going to be the elephant in the room with a big chunk of the revenue. How long after, what is the process for those meals taxes being dispersed back to the town, and what's the lag time on that?
Really good point in that, because I'm a lodging establishment owner. I know when I pay my taxes, and then when I was a finance director in Provincetown, I know when Provincetown receives it. So not till December 31st of this year will the town receive the revenues that came in for lodging or for meals for the months of August, September, and October.
Wow.
Okay, so
we won't know till the end of December what type of hit happened for the summer.
And it's absolutely and totally conceivable that the state can hang on to those a little bit longer in order to, hang on to their cash a little bit longer. So extending payables out is so that, not that I think the state would welch on making sure that we're made whole, but again, if they're coming into a crunch, it's absolutely conceivable that the meals tax and the turnaround time on that so we're not going to have a really good idea of the revenue impact until December. And I think it's
December at the earliest, and as was just explained to us, the governor issued an executive order last week that allows lodging establishments and restaurants to delay their payments to the state.
Yeah.
So there are payments that would normally be due now that don't have to be paid until September 20th.
Okay. So it's
all of a sudden we may see a shortfall just because the state is trying to help out lodging establishments.
Yeah. So the timing, the cash flow timing issue is going to be an issue for us too, because we might have to be covering our own shortfalls in cash flow when we're thinking about executing payments on some of these budget items.
It's possible, yes.
Nobody knows where the money's going to be when the music stops, basically. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that
Sure.
input.
Sure.
I was wondering, we don't have, we're not
Talk
going
over
to,
me, everybody.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, I've only been trying to say something for like half an hour.
Well, welcome to the meeting.
Hi.
You tell
I-
Janet.
One thing I wanted to say was I am seeing in my own business, there's going to be revenue. Obviously, the motels are closed, but house rentals and cottages and things, they are pretty solidly rented. So that's good, even if we won't see the money till the end of the calendar year. But we are taking a big hit on everything else. And I'm just wondering if anybody's discussed any new sources of revenue. Like,
Throw one out there. What do you got?
how about auctioning off building naming rights?
Cute.
Exciting prospect.
You know, somebody
I
might
like
put
it.
their name on the fire station, or pick a building.
It's an idea. I mean, like anything. I mean, you throw it up the flagpole, and if people like it, they like it, and suddenly.
That's not
I like it.
I mean, we haven't mentioned,
Probably thinking outside the box.
pot shops at all. I mean, I think there was an assumption that there was going to be revenue from there this summer.
Well,
that we're not going to
They're
see.
still working on the one on the corner of Main and 6. So
What's the deal on that? Do they have permitting issues? Who was in it? Was that Janet? Were you? Do you
Should've
know
been
what was
torn
going on?
down.
I have no
No,
idea. I
Kathy.
didn't find out that it was going to be a pot shop until relatively recently. So, but they are working.
I understand.
Looks
some
nice.
That forwarded around that they got their permitting. There
So
was-
I've not included any revenue from marijuana dispensaries in the budget. So
Okay.
anything that comes in would be gravy for us. Right now, I can't remember the name of it, but it's at the corner of Main and Route 6. They have all their permitting in place, so they are eligible to, I'm sorry, Rebecca's family is distracting me. So they have all their permitting in place, and there is one other place in town that just received their approval from the state. And
He walked right in front.
so we've got two that could be coming online relatively soon. And if we see money coming in from that, that would be something that wasn't included in the budget. So that would help our solution, I guess is how I'd put it.
A ray of light.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So Dan, I'm not organized in how I'm going to say this, so just bear with me here. And anybody else wants to jump in and correct me as I go. Not to summarize to finish, but to at least sort of summarize to where we are, because the Board of Selectmen or the Select Board said, "Oh, we want to hear what the FinCom recommends," but I'm trying to suss out in my head what is possible to recommend. So if I understand correctly what we've said so far, there seems to be not much appetite for not paying OPEB. And I know one of the selectmen last night said, absolutely, it's a bad idea. I think it was Helen. And we don't know yet, and we can't know yet what the shortfall is going to be this year. And much of it is going to affect the FY22 budget, not the FY21 budget. So far, I think I got that right. We have limited ability to negotiate at this point with the unions to adjust how many days they work and adjust their contracts. It's possible that it could happen, but we haven't even begun that process. And where would you begin too? Because there's also a question of you need some workers in season, you don't need them as much out of season. It's a complicated question of how big a department do you need in each area in January versus July. So let's assume that that's not going to happen anytime real soon. Those negotiations, you can't just do it. I mean, you can furlough an employee here and there, but you can't make fundamental changes to the overall workforce just like that. I'm not clear, I guess, pending the fact that we don't know what we don't know, and particularly don't know how long this is going to last, what kind of practical advice we can give anybody at this point, except areas of focus. And I'm happy to ask anybody, what am I missing on this? Because, I mean, these are all good points we're raising, but I don't hear where there's an actionable thing that we can recommend other than, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Which I'm happy to do as a FinCom, but Dan, I saw you just lit up. So is there some area that you, from this conversation or anyone, thinks, man, we should be advising the Board of Selectmen on this point?
I think Jeff has the answer. He has his hand.
I have the question. I was wondering if we could put up the operating budget revenue and expense spreadsheet that you created, Dan, and if you could just walk us through there and just sort of, as you go through it, highlight anything that you might think might be helpful while we have you here. Fred, is it possible for you to put that document up?
I don't know. I don't know how to do that in Zoom, actually. I have the document on my desk.
Hold on. What document do you need? I can screen share for you.
The one
The one that Dan sent, I assume the one he sent to us.
the last 3 pages of it.
Yep,
is
hold on. I'll grab it for you. Give me 1 second.
I printed it out. I got it right here.
Yeah, I do too, but I can't put it up on the
I
screen.
printed it out also.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, you let me know which one you want, because there are 3 pages.
Yeah, I was just hoping that Dan could kind of walk us through this and point to any, I mean, there's an awful lot here, and just anything he might be able to share as he was pulling this together, commentary on the numbers.
So, you know, just looking at what's on the screen right now, if we're looking at that 18.795 million, pretty much all of that is set in stone. Now, the variable there would be if collections started to drop, that people were unable to pay their mortgages and unable to pay their taxes, and collections started to drop in taxes. We can assess what's there. Will people pay those? You know, will they pay their tax bills? I think in the first year we've seen clear evidence that there won't be any adjustment there, or there wasn't really any effect. So it's something that we need to keep an eye on. And speaking of that, I think listening to the select board last night and listening to you guys tonight, I think what I'm going to kind of do is kind of summarize some of what our discussions have been, and point out to anybody who's looking at this that we don't know how much rooms and meals are going to be affected. And as Kathy asked, we're not going to know for sure until the end of December how much is impacted by in this particular year.
So Dan, to that, is it possible to do a best case, worst case, and median case on that? If the worst case is $1 million, when you redo the math and you say it's $1 million, my worst scenario, and best case is we lose nothing or minimal amount, is there there's sort of a likely number, or is there even a number in between where you go, man, we could make up to 300,000 pretty much no problem, but if it slides up to $500,000 or more, then we have more fundamental decisions to make. Just as a guide to say, where should we start to get really alarmed?
You know, for the most part, I would say yes, that I can do something like that. I think Suzanne Grout-Thomas can give me a fairly good idea of what she might expect to see for revenues in the beach fund. So, you know, in some areas, in something like CMAS, I don't have a clue. I really don't know if that'll be impacted, you know, if the sale of purple bags will be impacted by this virus.
Oh, I guarantee it is, because the guys at the dump tell me I don't have to use purple bags. I
Yeah.
went, they had an extra one. I used one the other day and they said, you know, you don't have to use that. So it's like, I guarantee.
Well, I'll have to get back to them because I thought they reinstituted them, but
No, the Board of
But-
Health is waiting until Labor Day to reinstitute the purple
Okay.
bags.
so you will
Yeah.
see that $400,000 in revenue definitely take a hit because we're not charging for purple bags. As Jeff mentioned, you know,
How
the
did we
cherry
make that
sheet
decision?
revenue. As Jeff mentioned, the cherry sheet revenue. I don't know what to expect from the state. I can't imagine that they would try to cut revenues to municipalities, seeing there's so much lobbying that goes on in that they would try to balance their budget based on towns. But when push comes to shove, where are they going to get it from? So on the sheet that's that's on the screen in front of you right now, towards the bottom right now where you see other raise and appropriate articles, part of that I think sends $50,000 into the stabilization fund. Another article suggests that we send $200,000 into completely lost my train. The OPEB fund, the OPEB trust fund. You know, if we don't want to do it, but there's a possibility of where you could say, okay, this year we can't do it, and acknowledging that we have to make it up in future years and hoping that it's not too long before things get back to a somewhat normal experience.
Is
What's
there,
the
Rebecca?
downside?
I'm sorry?
What's the downside of not funding OPEB for a year?
Probably not too much. When we looked at so what I did at one point is we were just kind of shooting in the dark as to what we were funding for OPEB. So I asked an actuarial firm who does this report that we get every 2 years on our OPEB trust fund liabilities, and asked them what we would need to pay to fund it, to have it fully funded in, I think it was in 25 years. And the amount that we had to pay was $165. So
Okay.
we're putting in a little bit extra each time. So if we missed a single year, we'd probably still be okay.
So if we did, so that's a possibility to say, okay, let's graduate OPEB payments maybe over the next 5 years. You know, so this year maybe we start with nothing, and then next year we increase to 20%, and then and maybe increase it, and then vote to fully fund it once we get back on our feet. If we're assuming this is a multi-year issue. So that's
Yep.
just a thought. I'll just throw that out there.
It's an option, and I would say from the last report, I think of all the towns on the Cape and the islands, we have the second highest percentage funding of our OPEB trust
That's
fund.
awesome. Awesome.
So we're doing much better than many other towns. So not to say we need to slack off on it, but if we really had to, we could reduce it for 1 year or eliminate it for 1 year, I would say.
is there a threshold on the stabilization fund or free cash relative to the budget of the town, or some other metric that says it needs to be at a certain level for the town to be considered whole and get the appropriate credit rating and whatnot?
Not as far as credit rating, but we have policies here in town about what our free cash should be. And we also have a policy regarding what the stabilization fund balance should be. And I think, if I recall, I think our stabilization fund says we should have a stabilization fund equal to 5% of our operating budget.
Right.
And we're at a point now where we're meeting that policy. So this additional 50,000 keeps us meeting the policy. So we'd only be 50,000 short if we didn't do it. You know, when I first started, we were funding more than this because we needed to get caught up. So if we didn't do it, if we didn't do the 50,000 this year, and we did 75 in the following year and 75, you'd still see the same effect. You know, you want to get caught up so that you're meeting your 5% policy, but it's not going to kill you if you don't have it in 1 year.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Courtney, Rebecca, I just tried to do it with my screen and it doesn't work that way. Can you move us down to the next page?
Good?
This is where we have to slightly, you know, as I'm going through this, I'm trying to logic it out, and I might come up with a logic on one day, and the following day I might have a different logic. I didn't expect that motor vehicle excise taxes would be affected much by COVID. I do recall that during the last downturn, that motor vehicle excise tax were affected a little bit because people weren't buying new cars, so their cars were aging, and therefore the excise tax was a lesser amount. So it could possibly have an impact. Don't know that for sure. Same thing down below where we're looking at boat excise tax. Your guess is as good as mine whether that gets impacted. Again, I think the room occupancy and meals tax will both be affected. In this situation, I think Wellfleet is lucky in that currently more of your room occupancy tax comes from short-term rentals than it does from hotels. As a hotel owner in Provincetown, I can tell you that if we hit 50% for the year, we'll be thrilled compared to what we did the year before. So you may be seeing more people who are willing to come and rent a home and be somewhat isolated than, you know, when they're staying in a hotel and they're dealing with other people around. So we may get lucky there. We may not have much of an impact, but your guess is as good as mine there.
And two questions. Is the number next to room and meals tax retained by the town, or is it in the state is shared?
This is 100% the town's share.
Okay, and the other question I had is a page earlier, there's an other excise column that's up over 130,000, I guess, from 373 to 507.
The other excise is the boat, room occupancy, and meals tax. That's what adds up to the other excise.
Okay.
That's the solid black line.
So that would be a line item we would be looking at very carefully come September to see how much that projected number got whacked.
Yep. You know, as we said, we won't know for sure until the end of December, but in September, you will see in September, the receipts are for April, May, June, and July. So you'll see one half of the busy summer month included there. You'll also see May included when there were no when short-term lodging was not allowed. June when it just started to come back, and then the month of July it'll give us an idea at the end of when we get that payment in September 30th to see what type of hit this is taking.
Okay.
And in a number of these, you could probably argue a number of ways. It's like penalty and interest. Okay, so, you know, I started to think kind of morbidly, okay, people will be poorer, so they won't pay their taxes on time and will get more penalties and interest. I chose not to go down that path. When you talk about various fees throughout the town, use of town-owned property, obviously, because we're not doing anything this year, are probably going to be close to zero. The rest of them, I'm not real sure how much I would be able to estimate one way or another of those, what are going to take a hit. There may be certain things that might come before conservation or for the planning board or zoning that there may be a slowdown, so they're not coming down. Have no idea. That's one of those things that what I think is a good thing to do, which I used to have our town accountant do, was tell me what you brought in, what the department brought in this month. How does that compare to last year's? And we may want to, you know, really be looking at that for pretty much all of these, to look for some spot or some thing that's flagging us and saying, okay, we're seeing something here. This is where something is going to be abnormal this year.
On the other side of the ledger, one of the big ticket items, say in the fire department budget, is overtime.
Yep.
But if we're thinking that there are going to be fewer runs to the hospital and less EMT work, maybe we're not thinking that, I don't know. But if that were the case, would that have an impact on the overtime budget?
It should. You know, as I just mentioned, they're down 3 officers, right, or 3 firefighters right now.
Right.
That's going to impact the overtime budget in a bad way, because if they're down 3 officers, they're going to have some people come in and work a second shift to be able to cover for somebody who's no longer there. So at this point, I can't tell you really how it's going to impact overtime for the fire department. As I was saying it earlier and talking about it, it possibly could be down because there's fewer runs. And then I'm thinking, well, if people think they're sick from COVID and they want to be taken to the hospital, maybe there'll be more runs. I don't know. I'm kind of just guessing.
Okay.
For people I see out and about on bicycles and just walking around, there could well be a significant number of ambulance runs this year. There are people here. There are a lot of people here.
An awful lot of people here.
And so much of this we're not going to know until after it's done, and we can look at it and say, okay, wow, this had an impact on this area, or this didn't. It's my best guess right now. So.
Dan, when
Tell
you
the select board that we've lost our crystal ball.
Yeah.
Dan, when you talk to other town administrators, how are they dealing with the same problem?
Good question.
You know what? They're dealing with it kind of in the same way that we are. Although I will say that in Provincetown, that they're more willing to furlough staff than what our discussion last night with the select board was. That they're one of the things that they looked at, and I read this online, so because I read it on Facebook, I know it's true. But somebody made a comment. Somebody made a comment on Facebook about how dare the select board decide that they're going to look at retirees' health insurance contributions. So I don't know if that was a discussion that they actually had, or if it was just somebody brought it up as this is a possibility. I'd have to go back and look at their meeting to actually see what was said. But they're kind of everybody's kind of looking at this in the same way. In Provincetown, because they bring in $2 million in parking revenue, that's probably going to take a severe hit this year. They also bring in close to $2 million in the room occupancy tax and $500,000 in meals tax. They're going to be looking at a really significant shortfall. And I haven't heard them come up with answers yet. They know it's going to be there, but they haven't figured it out yet. So.
Well, if it was me, I would cut everything 5% across the board. But I know that that's not popular, and that's just that's my suggestion.
If I was running the show and this was my company, the town of Wellfleet, and I think Dan has alluded to talking to the department heads already about this, is that I mean, maybe this is a long fiscal problem. Maybe it's not going to happen this year, but if you can save 1%, 2% in a month during the summer, if the library's closed anyway, if someone can take a day off a week and find employment somewhere else in town and be able to pay their mortgage by filling in around the gaps, it's a long-term team effort to get through this fiscally, financially, and
Everyone chip in.
everyone has to chip in. Maybe we got to have Friends of Recreation step up, Friends of Shellfish. And I suggested to the constable that get the guys that are going to benefit from the propagation program to get involved and first they'll know where you're propagating, and then you'll be getting free labor, but you've got to try to cut whatever percent you can over time. And it's a long range problem. And if there's people that benefit more in the recreation program, maybe they've got to put more into it themselves or their friends to raise money for these programs to keep them alive, rather than go to the taxpayer in general, redistribute it. And it's got to be a grassroots rethinking of, we've come a long way from the whole town of Wellfleet was supported by selling the rights to the herring run before 1900. It paid for the school, paid for the whole budget. And then the dike went in and that went by the boards. But Wellfleet's always been a very fiscally responsible town, I think. And I do, Dan's right. I think we are, bare bones, but maybe we've got to clean the bones a little bit. End of speech.
As the town administrator for another month, I will tell you, I look at our staff as one of our most valuable resources. So I agree that everything has to be on the table and we have to consider everything. I'm looking at it and trying to look at this from, I need to make this as fair as possible. I don't want to put people out of jobs. In some circumstances, we're not going to save a whole lot of money if we lay off somebody. If you have your own business in the town of Wellfleet, you pay a certain percentage of your wages into the state unemployment fund. A municipality doesn't do that. So if John Smith is laid off from the Council on Aging and he gets $400 a week in unemployment insurance, the town actually pays that $400. It doesn't come out of the state's unemployment fund. We actually pay for the actual costs. So there's not as much of a benefit, I guess I would say, as you might think. I'm saying this out loud and I haven't really thought it through, so don't mess with me if I screw up. But what I'm thinking is, if the if the federal government decides another stimulus program and some part of that is enhanced unemployment benefits through the end of the year, there may be a way that if we let somebody go for 6 months and they could be on an unemployment, that they could make as much on unemployment as they did working for the town. And if that type of a situation exists, it would be a somewhat painless way to cut our budget to some extent. My understanding is that with the $600 additional per week that the federal government was doing that runs through the end of July, is that if you made $60,000 or less, you could make the same thing being on unemployment. So if that's the scenario, there might be a creative solution there where we're not forcing a staff member to lose their income. They would still be getting their income just in a different format, and we do it as a temporary furlough for 6 months or whatever. So it's an option down the road that we can always look at, but as I've said before, the staff I think is probably one of our most valuable resources in town. But we'll look at creative ways of doing this, and so if there
I would agree with Mr. Hort.
Thank you. If there are departments where they have staff people who would prefer to work for 80% of their compensation and work 80% of their hours, if we make that optional and some people want to take that up for a while, great. It helps us all. So, but I right now I have I don't have any intent, and I don't think the select board expressed any intent last night of looking at any staff furloughs or cutting staff compensation. So
But I had a thought about, again, kind of summing up what we've been talking about, and tell me if
If
this
I wrap it up.
makes Linda.
Sorry.
That's cool. I think that's, it's not a bad suggestion. It sounds to me like we're talking about two different scenarios to some degree. One is that this is a hiccup that'll be mostly over by next year, and the adjustments we have to make are tactical. A little money moved here, a little OPEB there, a little bit of this, and we solve our problem, and Wellfleet goes on however it goes on. Doesn't mean it's, it's whole from that point on, but it's governed the way it's governed. The other one is that this is a multi-year scenario that is going, and we're going to have a recurrence of this kind of conversation every year for the next 1, 2, 3, we don't know how many years. In which case, some of these suggestions about tightening the belt, reducing overall costs by 5%, and so on, come into play much more directly because the town has to tighten its belt for the longer run. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you were going to make recommendations, you wouldn't make one or the other, you'd make both. You'd say, like Yogi Berra, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So if the road goes left, there's maybe a set of recommendations to say you can take some money out of OPEB. This is all temporary. The thing Kathy was talking about before, pay it back over the course of a few years. Problem solved, maybe. If it goes the other way, then we're having conversations more along the lines of what Bob was just talking about, which is we're all going to have to take a hit. Well, I'm not working, but we're all going to have to tighten our belts and figure out a way to negotiate with the unions, furlough people, or reduce workloads to 4 days or whatever. That isn't necessarily something we have to do if this is over by next year. Is that fair?
What's that gonna be?
That's fair. That's fair. But I think it's good to have the conversation to start to begin to where we, I think this is definitely a good conversation to start to have about what the thoughts are and going forward on it.
So what I'd ask, I guess, of the committee, if you guys are up to it, in the next few days, summarize your thoughts about both scenarios or either one, whichever one you feel good with, and send them, I guess, to Rebecca, and we'll collate them and we'll see if there's any consensus at all around the two different approaches, okay? One being the short term, this is only a 1-year problem, so we have to solve that problem. The other one being a longer term set of changes to the way the town manages its finances. Because clearly, I mean, one of the major area of concern is personnel and salaries and benefits, because that's where most of the money is. And it would be worth also, I think, putting a little time into thinking how each one of those scenarios gets affected by the shortfalls that we've been talking about. The obvious ones being beach and meals and so on, but the less obvious ones being the one you brought up, Kathy, which is what if we see a significant drop off in tax revenues from real estate for whatever reason, because people are out of work, because they have to sell their businesses and their homes. All of the things we've discussed are in play, but the net is that we lose, pick a number, 5% of that number, and that's a big number. 5% of that number is huge. So that would be a whole bit different problem for the town. $500,000 shortfall from the beach and meals and so on, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to start. Summarize it, think about it, and get some stuff down on paper, because that's it. I'm done.
But I'm going to ask that you forward that to Rebecca within the next few days. Write it down while it's fresh. Don't worry about it being right. Just write down your thoughts, and then we'll revisit all of this. Maybe via email. We'll see. I don't know if we can do that via open meeting law, but
Awesome.
but we'll come together on an opinion. This is generically what the FinCom's opinion is, if it's a short-term thing and it's a long-term thing. And we can then pass that on to the select board and let them run with it for a bit. Jeff, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it sure would be nice if we kind of incorporated IRA's 5% and going back to the individual departments and having, and I don't know if we do this with Dan or this is the first thing that our new town administrator does, but it sure seems to me if we could get each department to look at their budgets and say, come up with one that's 5% less, it gives us a starting point at where there may be some, ways that we could look at pulling back. I don't know. I would just like to see something from the bottom up, from the individual departments, looking at their budgets, realizing that we are in an emergency crisis situation, and then see what recommendations the departments heads will come back with.
I think it's a good suggestion. The issue, and you'd have to look at each department's budget to know. My guess is that if you looked at any major department, DPW say, and said, I'm going to find 5% in that budget, you'd be whacking personnel to some degree. You'd be whacking salaries and benefits to some degree. Now you're dealing with a union issue in the negotiation, not just the discretion of the department head.
There is a way to manage personnel. It sounds very much like we don't have the appetite to furlough people and that's kind of a last resort. But there is a way to manage personnel and salaries through attrition. It's done in the corporate world all the time. If somebody leaves, if it's not, obviously police and fire, security are one thing, but if somebody leaves, there's not an all-out rush to run out tomorrow and rehire somebody. Obviously, there are key positions that has to happen with, but it might be an opportunity to look and say, hey, can we do without that service? And then employ Bob's point and say, is there somebody on the town that might want to volunteer? Is there a group that we could have that provides that service? So I think this is going to be an all-in. I don't think there is anybody or any department that's not going to be touched by trying to have to solve this problem right down to the individual residents. So it's huge and complex, but I feel good. This was a good first step. So.
And it's a longer term question too. Linda, did you want?
If I can just bring up some history, two town administrators ago, we tried this. He did not fill a number of positions as they became vacant. And it turned out that none of the departments functioned well without those positions filled. And eventually they were all filled, but he did try to reduce the number of personnel in town through attrition. And it turned out it's fine in the short term, but eventually those positions are going to have to be filled because it turns out we're not really running with a lot of fat in the personnel area.
But that's a short term, so maybe if that doesn't work, it's a short term gap filler.
Sure, absolutely as a short term gap filler, but don't think of it as a permanent reduction.
And some departments are already doing that. I know the library is down one or two. I see Jennifer is there. The library is down one or two personnel as we speak, and they are functioning as best they can, which is not optimal. They were functioning better when they had those people, but for now, because there was attrition, they have to deal with what they've got. And every department's going to be a little bit different. Like we're talking about, the fire department is going to be different than the library. It's going to be different than DPW. You can get away with overtime more or less in some areas than in others. Services some of them are critically important. Some of them are nice to have, but that's a TA and select board level conversation about what they want the town to be, right? What's the quality of service and all that. We pretty much all we have the latitude to do is advise on ways to get there financially, without guidance at this point on whether the town really wants to get to a level that, let's say for the sake of argument, that a 5% reduction is 5% lower quality of service or availability of service, that you don't get the same level of service for less money. I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but it's often true. So if that's what people want, if the town is willing to go that route, then you can go that route, but you have to go there as a town.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You got to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah, yeah. Does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight?
And of course, people get the opportunity at town meeting to vote for what they think is essential. to add to the budget.
That's right.
Doesn't mean that they throw it out the window. It means that they get to actually talk about what they think is essential as a town.
And to that point was what I was trying to get at before about taking some of the cost of a department out of the operating budget and throwing it to the town as an additional cost and say, look, this is what you got. This is maybe the optimal version of it. If you want it, you're gonna have to pay this much extra to get it. Maybe.
It's going to take, see, it's going to, and this is incumbent on the town hall staff. It's going to take a lot of explaining. People are really going to have to crunch a lot more information than they're used to crunching at town meeting.
And we know how that goes.
Exactly.
Didn't they suspend the rec program for the whole summer? No?
There
I
are
don't know.
programs that are coming online in July that have been approved by the health agent.
Okay. So pretty much business as usual for the summer then, huh?
I don't think so. So I've asked the recreation department to reconfigure what their seasonal staff need is based on the more limited programming that they have this summer.
So I'm thinking we might want to wrap this conversation up. And Dan, do you have any like final thoughts or ideas about what we've discussed that will guide us?
You know,
developing
my final thought was that I needed to run to the restroom, and I wasn't sure how to do it without being missed, because you'd probably ask me about something. I would welcome the thoughts that you're going to send to Rebecca, because as I've said, I don't have all the answers. You know, this is going to have to come from the select board, the finance committee, and from the community about what's important to us. What are we willing to pay for, and what do we think is that we can cut? It's not going to be an easy conversation.
No. So it's Wednesday now. If everybody could try to get something to Rebecca, if they have something by Monday, and then next week we'll kind of go through it and see what we can pull out of it.
And per open meeting law, you can send it to me and then I can send it out to you as long as I'm the middleman. You guys are okay. You just can't deliberate anything over email.
Good to know. Good. Does anybody have any liaison reports they want to run by? I've got one quick thing on the schools that you guys probably would find interesting, but it's very quick. Other than that, anybody else?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. Last night's meeting with the energy department for the energy and climate impact committee. You know, they're looking at the plan still for the new regional high school, and I think quoting Dick Elkin, there's never enough time to do something the first time, but there's always enough time to have to redo it. And, you know, his feeling, the whole committee is just saying, it is crazy that we're building a building on using gas as the heat when the state is mandating we're going to a net zero. So I think it's just adding more to, it'll be interesting to see what we're going to do at this high school and whether or not the plans as originally presented are ever going to flow through to town meetings. We'll see.
Well, and that's a good segue to what I had to say. I talked to Tom Conrad the other day. The school board has sent another request for an extension to the MSBA, which is the granting authority for the 35 million or so that the state is supposed to pony up towards the construction. Currently, they have an extension to September, I think. And they're hoping to get another extension out to the spring. On the theory, I guess, and now I'm going to speak out my butt here, so to speak, that this fall might not be the best time to be asking people to pony up that kind of money. And that it would be better to give people a little bit of time to settle into their own town issues, which is what we've been talking about tonight. So there's no determination at this point that I'm aware of about whether the article relating to the school's building will be on the warrant this fall. I think it's a wait and see until they see what the MSBA comes back with in terms of a yes or a no.
I thought that they were on a use it or lose it. I thought that their situation.
Well, and that's an interesting point. I talked to Dick Elkin the other day, and he was of the opinion that the money's already in the bank and they can delay it themselves. That is not true. If the MSBA says, no, you can't delay it, and they can't coordinate a positive vote from 3 of the 4 towns in time, they lose it. And that means they go to the back of the bus again with no guarantee they'll ever see the money again. I know, and this is completely anecdotal, that there was conversation about a green alternative to the one they chose. There was some determination, as I understood it, that it was going to cost $5 or $6 million more. I imagine there were other questions that would have also cost $5 or $6 million more, and a bunch of them ended up in the hopper, including solar, I guess. So I can't speak, and I wouldn't even try to speak definitively to why they went with the power plant they went with, but I know the goal overall was to come up with the lowest cost alternative, and that we ended up with. But whether we're going to see it on the warrant in the fall, I think is anybody's guess right now. That's it. That's my report.
Good one.
Hey. Anybody else, any other business?
Well, let's
I
just
just
say
need to
everyone smokes a lot of pot and we get a lot of revenue from it.
Yeah, and we don't have to go to Pete's again.
Down with that.
It's about time. It's about time that Wellfleet opened one of its many new pot shops so that we could do comparison shopping.
Hey, the Wagner could be turned into a bed and bud, right?
I did see.
Wow.
I saw somebody cleaning up the facade today of the old. What do they call it? The rusted gold place next to Dunkin' Donuts, which is going to be one of the pot
Oh
shops.
yeah, that's going to be another pot shop, I guess.
Yeah, and it looks like they're starting to clean it up.
Right.
But they're so far in the preliminary stage. And I haven't seen anything happening with the South Wellfleet General Store. But the one on the corner of the bank looks like it's getting close.
What about the one in town?
Don't know about that one. You mean the one where the health store used to be?
Where
That
the
one
hell's
in the old bank building on Bank Street. I know. I would love for that one to open up because it's around the corner from me.
There you go.
There he goes. Rebecca, have we seen your entire family?
Not only my entire family, you're seeing my best friend go by.
Nice. Well, it's nice to have friends. They're
My last comment is that Linda had the best camera angle. I mean, she looked like she was like 15 years old tonight. So good job on the optics, Linda.
Thank you. I try so hard and I've always failed. So I appreciate that, Kathy.
And I see I'm receding into the darkness here, so
You are.
I can put the light on.
I'm not gonna. I'm gonna.
Call for a move to adjourn. I move we adjourn.
I second.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Bye.
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 Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.